Hello, everyone. We are very lucky that we have some of the country's leading experts on putting a price on carbon at the state level here with us in the room. Yeah, that's worth a round of applause. Today, we are very lucky to hear from, starting from my left, Michael Green, who is the executive director of ClimateXChange, a nonprofit that exists to put prices, to price carbon at the state level. Then we have Jessica Langerman, who is a co-founder and board member of ClimateXChange. And then we have Camila Thorndike, who is currently the carbon pricing coordinator at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Camila also founded Our Climate. Yeah. I talked yesterday a little bit about the importance to CCL's national and congressional strategy that state-level carbon pricing has. And this is something that CCL is leaning more and more into. Whatever state you live in, you either live in one of two states, a state with an existing carbon pricing campaign or a state without an existing carbon pricing campaign. If you live in a state with a campaign, there is a campaign that you should be getting involved in that can use your help. These are campaigns that need a lot of grassroots volunteer and effort, and I think CCL, I work on coalitions with other nonprofits on carbon pricing, and there are other nonprofits that work on a lot of issues with a lot of volunteers, and they say, CCL volunteers are incredible. They know everything about carbon pricing. How did you teach them everything about carbon pricing? And well, it took about 10 years, but seriously, if you live in a state that has a carbon pricing campaign, please send me an email or follow up with me or go to the website or go to the community and follow the state-level carbon pricing action team, and we can plug you into those campaigns. If you live in a state that doesn't have a campaign to put a price on carbon, if a bill has never been introduced in your state legislature, let's get one introduced in January. And we're training volunteers to have the skills to know how to do that. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, and we're going to hear first from Michael.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And it's wonderful to get to be up here and represent the various state efforts that are going on. And my two colleagues to the left here are doing an amazing job here in DC and in Maryland, and we'll have a little bit to share with them. And ClimateXChange, as many of you here probably sat on our panel last year, and we were just hoping that we would have more to kind of get into and be making more progress, but efforts on the state level is just about as faceted nationally, but hopefully we're going to get there first. So want to kind of share a little bit about in context to what's happening in Massachusetts, and also kind of what we've seen over the past 5 years of working on carbon pricing on the state level, but also some more broad scope things to be focusing on when you're working on a coalition, and how you can be getting engaged. And we see the CCL volunteers as such an amazing resource in Massachusetts and other states where it's actually the boots on the ground getting the work done. But there's a couple of things that are worth keeping in mind when you're getting involved with campaigns and trying to find ways to move things forward. And really the three key pieces that I've been sitting and kind of thinking on what I would share with you guys. First, the importance of, and we'll get into this a bit more, is building a coalition, working on your strengths and finding allies to work on theirs, and of course remaining flexible. It might be things that are somewhat intuitive and you're like, yeah, of course that makes sense, but to give some detail, some stories, and some thinking behind why these things are so crucial. We've seen focusing on the importance of building a coalition. When we had Massachusetts first come together to work on carbon pricing, we actually had a bill in the state Senate and in the House, and it's actually something that we didn't quite support. And instead, we took the time, rather than pushing a bill that didn't have capacity behind it, to start to bring together a small team. And it's great because the first almost 2 years we met in individuals' houses and family rooms. A lot of what I'm sure you guys are experiencing in your chapters back in your home states. And it was volunteers, it was empowered, engaged individuals. But we got to a point where we realized as individuals and as a purely grassroots effort, you can only get things so far. There's a real something to be said about reaching out and working with the other, whether it's environmental groups and bipartisan groups, business groups, and it's because of that engagement and because of that coalition, we've continued to have resources to depend on. We've continued to have bodies, different outlooks, different perspectives that have all come up and played their own kind of key role at key times. One of the things that we've never kind of stopped in doing in building our coalition is every coalition, in order to fuel it and go through momentum, you kind of go through these 3 steps of awareness, educating them, and engaging them. So you're telling someone about carbon pricing and making them aware about what the policy is, right? But it's usually you're not going to get the message across in one meeting. It takes a few meetings for them to actually start to really understand, okay, this is how this policy actually means for our state or for our country or even for our small business. So you go from helping them become aware to educating to then empowering them, and making them feel like they can make a difference. This is essentially the recipe that many of you use to grow your local chapters. But it shouldn't stop there. It needs to then progress into building a coalition and reaching out to other partner organizations. So we've had times where our business lobby in Massachusetts actually stays about kind of arm's length away from the rest of the grassroots and the environmental community. We hold separate lobby days. We do separate sign-on letters. And it's not just that, but we've also done that with faith and religious groups. And at individual key times, we've been able to leverage those communities, leverage those networks, whether it's trying to get Cardinal O'Malley to endorse carbon pricing, or it's sitting down and convening the largest businesses. Now, we've actually kind of Chatham House rules here a little bit, but we've been able to have several times where we've brought the 20 largest industry and business groups across Massachusetts to sit down in one room and talk about the opportunities of carbon pricing, most recently with our Senate president, former Senate president. We'll get back to that when we get to the 3rd lesson of remaining flexible. But sitting down with him and being able to bring the business voices together is something that we wouldn't have been able to leverage and do unless we had real business voices at the table, not just people who were organizing around the private sector, but actually, business owners, people who are working directly with the utilities. So kind of getting into knowing your strengths and, making sure that we, maybe you guys might phrase it as, staying in your lane or knowing what your lane is. As volunteers and as you grow your coalition, you can't be everything, right? So, and at the same time, you can't be everything, and in order to solve climate change, it's going to take everyone. So find people that are going to be able to really manage and understand online communications. There's a skill set there that you might not have that's really important in bringing in when you start to form a coalition or form a team pushing on a state policy. Find someone that is kind of a creative designer, has that marketing eye that can help you get that work done, or an organization when you're at different conventions or opportunities and you see a flyer for another local enviro group and they've got a really sharp looking flyer. Remember that, because that means they have somebody on their team that helped them make that, and when you get to a point in your campaign when you need to have printable materials, it's really good for them to be able to bring that asset on. Now, in the last piece on kind of remaining flexible, something that we've learned time and time again, and it's something that from my kind of CCL upbringing, we have these core principles and core ideas on how carbon pricing should look and how it should be put into place. And when I've gotten into the political landscape, it's been anything but that, right? So we've now had 5 different bills that put a price on carbon in Massachusetts, and this now being, I believe, the 6th that was released on Thursday, doesn't look like anything that we've seen before. It is extremely minimal in its scope and prescriptiveness, but it's the cards that we're currently being dealt, and we have a month and a half left in the session. Am I going to fight that in order to make it look like a carbon pricing bill that I believe we should have in the state of Massachusetts? Or do we take that and do we build upon it in a future session? Part of it is a values call, but also part of it is remaining flexible. Back to that meeting with the private sector and our former Senate president, we had times when we thought, okay, we've got the businesses engaged, the Senate president has signed, sealed off on this initiative. Well, unfortunately, he was removed from office about a month later. And it was because we kind of had a large campaign and we had coalition partners that had spread out not just to the private sector and to the Senate president, but the person who would then become Senate president, that we were still able to keep that influence. So as you're hearing more of our stories across the 3 of us and what's going on in your states, kind of keep that in your back pocket as a little bit of a framework for how these stories played out and what are the opportunities and how does it translate back to the campaigns you're working on in your home state. Thanks.
I would just like to give a special thanks to Michael because he has been working for 5 years to get carbon pricing passed in Massachusetts, and the bill is being voted on today or tomorrow?
Thursday.
Okay, this week, and he still made the trip, so.
Okay, testing, 1, 2, 3, is it on?
Close.
Closer, okay. All right, thank you, hi. Well, my name is Jessica Langerman, and I'm so pleased to be here, especially as Camila said, there just couldn't be a lovelier audience than a CCL audience. So I've been a member of CCL since 2012, and back in 2013, I became convinced that this fight needs to be fought on 2 fronts, the federal and at the state. So I'm one of the co-founders of ClimateXChange, and at that time I was living in Massachusetts, where, as Michael was describing, a group of us CCLers were beginning to feel the same way. And at that time we became aware of a state senator who had already filed a carbon pricing bill for the state, which took us all by surprise. He was really all out ahead of us. So we put our heads together and asked him, what did he need to be successful? And he said at that time he needed a study, but he couldn't afford one. So it was our group who pooled our funds, and we commissioned Remy to do the very first carbon pricing study in the nation. And boy, believe me, I never thought I would be sitting in front of a crowd telling that story and getting applause. Thank you. I never was so petrified in my life. I had never spent that much money on anything outside a car or a condo. I even cracked a molar one night, grinding my teeth. I was so petrified what the results would be because we didn't know at that time. We thought perhaps the bill would be analyzed and we would find out that it was harmful for the poor and the working class, that it might not reduce emissions, and the question became, what would we do then? But to our joy, it turned out that the results of that Remy study were very similar to the results of the national Remy study, in that a statewide carbon fee can be designed in such a way as to protect the bottom 60% of income earners, just like at the national level. And it can be designed so that households and businesses, and this is key if you are working at the state level, households and businesses can receive dividend checks to make them more or less whole. Mostly across the spectrum of the economy, it's a positive equation for most households and most businesses, but there is a small number of businesses who, of course, are the losers, and they are the chemical and oil and gas industries, big surprise. So we were not too unhappy about that. At any rate, I would love to tell you kind of on a concrete level how we have progressed here in Maryland. As Michael stated, we had a bill in Massachusetts. That bill The senator who submitted it warned us it would probably take 6 to 10 years to get that bill passed. We are now on year 5, and it is going to pass. He told me on Monday he believes it will pass out of the Senate. If that is the case, that will be the first state in America to pass a carbon pricing bill out of any chamber in the legislature. So, okay. This is so awesome. This is the cure for depression about the climate, isn't it? It is for me. So anyway, that is fantastic news. The bad news is that it will not pass out of the House, we predict. But as Senator Barrett said, 6 to 10 years. So, okay, we live to fight another day. So about 2 years ago, I moved down here to Maryland, and I was thrilled to discover what a fantastically progressive, fabulous state Maryland is. It's very similar to Massachusetts in many ways. We have a Democratic supermajority and a Republican governor. So last year at this time, we in Maryland had nothing. We had no carbon pricing bill, nothing. Now it is June of 2018, and we have not only conducted a number of studies through ClimateXChange, which is part of what our organization now does for people who are working at the state level, but we also actually drafted legislation. We found a number of legislators that were very happy to submit it. 2 of them took the job on, and they did drop that bill in the Maryland legislature in January of this year. It was one of only 3 environmental bills to be heard before the Economics Matters Committee in Maryland, where it was roundly defeated, unsurprisingly, but more on that in just a moment. So how did we do that? And how can you do that? I will tell you. So when I first moved here, I formed a CCL chapter in my town, and because we live in a really blue state, as I expect some of you in this room probably do too, many CCL volunteers felt frustrated because they weren't really, they felt like their congressmen and women were already doing everything they possibly could, and they almost felt embarrassed to keep after them about carbon fee and dividend. So I asked them, would there be any in the group who would be interested in working at the state level? And a number, maybe 10 or 15 people volunteered. So this is what we began doing, step by step. We started holding separate monthly meetings. We researched existing greenhouse gas laws here in the state, and many states already have mandates for greenhouse gas reduction. Right? So in Maryland, there was a greenhouse gas reduction bill already in place where the greenhouse gases were supposed to be reduced by 40% by 2030. So who was in charge of making this reduction? So again, thanks to a spectacular volunteer in our group named Larry Liebsman, who is sitting quietly in the audience here, Larry found us the Maryland Climate Change Commission. Now that is an organization that is appointed by the administration, and it has a mandate to advise the governor and the General Assembly on ways to mitigate the causes of and prepare for the consequences of climate change. So thanks to Larry, we became aware that they had themselves conducted a study analyzing all of their plans for the state of Maryland to meet this law. And according to their own study, they stand to fall between 6 and 16 million, is it megatons, Larry? Million tons of CO2 a year short. So that's quite a range, 6 to 16 million, but we know that it's not good. So that gave us kind of an in, because we found out that commission is open to the public. They have meetings open to the public. And Larry and Cheryl Arney, who's also here, another volunteer, began attending those meetings and kind of making their presence known. So those meetings, that commission is comprised of representatives from the private sector, from renewable and traditional energy providers, environmental organizations, government agencies, etc. So having this study completed and having a bill already submitted, we invited Mark Breslow, who's the economist who did our study, down from Massachusetts to speak at, before this commission. And Mark came down, and with Larry, who's an environmental attorney, he and Larry gave a spectacular presentation about how our bill, which is called RCCI, which stands for the Regional Carbon Cost Collection Initiative, and I have lots of summaries of it here if you're interested, about how that bill would actually fill the gap. It would provide that extra drawdown of that CO2, what is predicted to be the gap. It was a pretty compelling argument that they made. However, the commission that was listening to it really wanted none of it. And this will give you an idea kind of what we're up against. Larry and Mark were subjected to some really hostile, I thought, quite hostile questioning. And the chair of the commission, who is administration appointed, kind of broke into the conversation and said, well, we're not going to arrive at any consensus today. So although we are responsible to provide a report in 2020 to the governor, we will not be considering carbon pricing. Later, we got our hands on the minutes of that meeting, and we found out that they had entirely omitted any notes whatsoever from Mark Breslow's presentation. It wasn't even in the minutes. So these are the ways in which you begin to make noise. What we need right now in Maryland is we need volunteers. So if any of you live in Maryland and might be willing to do this, we need volunteers to go with us to these meetings, to stand up, to raise your hand, and to say, as one gentleman did at the last meeting, who was a former member of this commission, he stood up and said, these are the only people who have brought to you a solution. They have the data and the numbers to prove that there is a solution, and you refuse? You refuse to include this in your report? He was only one man, however. We need more. We need 10 citizens of Maryland. We need 15 to say, you must do this. So I've probably talked longer than I should right now, so maybe I'll stop and I'll hand it over to Camila. But I'm happy to answer. Yes, Larry.
Also, the issue of modeling, because the commission says we're not even going to work carbon pricing in the model that they're doing to come up with a plan and public comment by the end of this year. So that's the big push now.
Right.
Try to get them to say you have to consider pricing in the models that you're working through to produce the data on how all these measures are supposed to achieve 40 by 30. So that's our big effort right now in terms of getting some political support within this climate change commission.
That is exactly right. And as Michael said, there is a big tension. There's a lot of tension in doing this work. One is that when you appear on the scene, wham, you're brand new, and you haven't really bothered to make friends with other environmentalists who've been working in Maryland for 30 years. You haven't bothered to mention to any business communities. You haven't had conversations with stakeholders. You find yourself offending people. People aren't too happy really to listen to you because who the heck are you and what have you done for them lately? So our failure has been we've moved at lightning speed. We got this bill done, we started attending these commission meetings, but we're no one from nowhere, as a woman once said to my face. You are a no one, nobody from nowhere. How dare you insert yourself into this fight? So my advice to you is to make friends. CCL, if I dare say that we have a flaw, it is that we don't seem to play well in the sandbox with others. We tend to be rather rigid and doctrinaire. We think we have the one answer. I know I do. I can't help it. I do. We're very laser focused. For me, that's been a joy in a way because it gives me something to laser focus on. But I think for others, we come across as arrogant and know-it-all oftentimes. So I've been dressed down by a number of stellar organizations, and that was in Massachusetts, I'm happy to say. I haven't managed to offend anyone here yet too badly. So I just want to encourage you all that as you begin this, to make friends, to be open, to not be so doctrinaire, what we accomplish at the state level will be different from what we're hoping to accomplish at the federal level. Okay, I'll stop.
And we'll take questions at the end, but I just wanted to say one more thing about the great campaign in Maryland that Jessica's working on. Before I worked at CCL, I was working professionally on environmental issues in Maryland. There were 3 bills this year, like Jessica said. One of the bills, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, the League of Conservation Voters, Maryland Environmental Health Network, Interfaith Power and Light, all got together. They introduced that bill. There was another bill where Food and Water Watch, Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, Sierra Club, they all got together. They introduced the second bill. The third bill, Jessica and 10 of her friends got together and introduced that bill.
And in fact, if I may, I would like to ask Phil and Larry and Cheryl and anyone else from our group who's here today to stand up. Would you please? This is Phil, Sarah, Cheryl, Larry. Okay. These are CCLers. They have no more special talents than anybody else in this room, right? We just decided that by God we were going to do this. So I hope that you will consider doing the same thing yourselves.
Jessica pretends like she's nervous before these things. You always nail it. Hi everyone, my name's Camila, and I've been working in DC on a local carbon fee for over 2 years now. Before that, from Oregon. Yeah, Tamara. Who else? Yeah, Lucy. Awesome. Hey, Brian. And it's always, a shot in the arm to come to the conference and feel like you're in like a sports stadium.
Yeah, being cheered.
All caps. Sorry. Yes. So I just want to second everything they said, and I think what I can add is maybe the way I think about our campaign so far, and the 3 things that have mattered most. We started 3 years ago with a small group of organizations in DC, and we are on the verge, I don't know where there's some wood, but hopefully a bill will be introduced in a month's time. It's supposed to be introduced last week, so we've got some pressure cooker action going on right now. And for those of you who aren't aware, DC, the district, is neither a state nor a city, really. It should be a state. We have more people than Wyoming or Vermont, but we're essentially disenfranchised. Like, we don't have a voting member of Congress. So that's because nobody currently with enough power wants a permanently Democratic 51st state. So someday we're going to get it. Just to take a step back to tell you a little bit more of how I got here, I've been working on climate for, I think, 12 years. I wish I had more to show for myself. But we have, about 5 years ago, started with CCL. So I owe everything I know about carbon pricing to CCL when I was a chapter co-leader in Southern Oregon, and then with Mark Tabbert in Southern California and Orange County. And much like Jessica, decided that, gosh, there's so much pent-up energy, can't we direct it at the state level? So started an organization called Oregon Climate, which is now Our Climate, which is here at the conference, mobilizing young people across the country to get involved in carbon pricing work. And when I met my now fiance, by the way, thank you, Wes, who was working in the Senate on carbon pricing, I decided, okay, I'm going to move to DC. Chesapeake Climate Action Network, CCAN, is the region's premier climate and energy group working in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. And Mike Tidwell, our executive director, said, well, we want to run a carbon tax campaign here. Would you do it? So it was dream come true. DC's got one of the highest concentrations of climate-concerned people in the whole country. Just to give you a sense, we're 96% of the vote went to Hillary, and we have just 13 council members, which act sort of as state legislators. The highest you can get is the mayor. So it's a really small building. You can cross it in 5 minutes. You can get to know people really well. There's sort of a weird lack of ambition, which has actually become sort of a problem for us. But before we get to that, step 1 of importance is really the coalition building. So as Michael and Jessica have been saying, make friends, get your team built before you start working on the policy picture. Totally great to go in with a vision of, in our case, we actually wanted to do 100% fee and dividend. And yet, considering the political realities of who had been working in the district on these issues, who do you need in your coalition? Otherwise, you're going nowhere. In our case, very much the Sierra Club and the DC Environmental Network. We actually invested in a multi-month, professionally facilitated process. Justin Wright out of Boston with a firm called Active Neutrals, highly recommend him. I think he'll be on a ClimateXChange state call in the fall if anybody wants to tune in for that. He was our facilitator along with a local note taker and team, and he stepped us through this incredible, very quick but in-depth process of 4 3-hour-long closed-door meetings where really anybody was welcome to come, but we had some of our core organizations, both from the environmental side, and for us it was really important to involve economic justice partners at the beginning as well. So at the outset we thought, how can we marry climate and economic justice, and with it all the racial justice issues that are related from the beginning. So we had the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, we had SEIU, we had a Working Families Party, and we wanted to design something that would lift people up in a very material way as we were solving the climate problem, not on the backs of the poor. So we emerged from that process with 100% consensus behind the bill that we've been championing for the last 2 years. Thank you. That was really exciting because coming from the West Coast, where in Oregon and Washington we had not had 100% consensus on various issues, to me that was the first real victory in this campaign, was to say, wow, with the help of people who understand what it is to shape a vision together that's based on shared values and really amicably arrive at a place where not everybody gets everything that they want, but we're going to do it together. That actually is a learned thing that people go to grad school for, and you should hire them. And I think, no need to reinvent that wheel, kind of to Michael's point, that we're each going to have a skill, and some people do this for a living, and they're really worth tapping. So that was exciting. Then I think the second important thing that was also mentioned is having a study, but also working it within the context of an existing framework that your jurisdiction has set for itself. It's really, really, really powerful to be able to say, hey, Mayor so-and-so, hey, Governor so-and-so, you already committed to this goal. How are you going to get there? We actually do have a solution, and that's why it's criminal that this work in Maryland is being repressed, but it won't be repressed for long because enough people know it's a no-brainer. We have to do something about climate. Wow, look at the numbers, can't argue with them. So how are we going to get there? And the pressure will keep building to the point where you can then say, we have a solution, and why don't you do it? And so in our case, the Sustainable DC plan that was put together has a whole hodgepodge of a bazillion little bits and pieces kind of policies that they have on a bar graph showing, okay, here we're going to get to 50% reductions by 2032. They actually pre-suppressed carbon pricing because they knew that it was so controversial. And the District of Office of Energy and the Environment, they had a whole explanatory letter where they're kind of tying themselves in knots trying to explain why. Turns out they had put together a whole study on what a carbon price in DC would look like well before we started this campaign, and then they deep sixed it, and it was only Bloomberg News FOIA'd this report, Freedom of Information Act, and they got their hands on it, and that's how we learned about it. Everybody assumed that we leaked this thing to the press, but we're getting a call from the reporter going, wait a minute, this agency has already looked at a carbon tax, and actually it'd be really good, but there's a lot against us, right, in trying to actually pass this policy because it actually deals with the problem. So we can keep saying, look, you're not going to meet your goals without this policy. Ours is the one that takes the largest chunk of our emissions out of the portfolio. You either need to have an alternative or you need to get on board. And then the third thing and last thing I'll say is that the political framing, in looking back on these last 2 years, I wish that we had reverse engineered it a little bit more, starting with a power map of who you're dealing with. So in this coalition process, as you're looking at the road ahead, who's heard of a power map? Raise your hand. Okay, cool. So about half the room. So figure out your list of people with decision-making authority. and the people who then influence the decision makers, and then the people who influence them. You could think about it in 3 tiers. I mean, there's lots of ways to go about it, but basically, actually like get a whiteboard out and draw some circles and write some names and say, how are we going to get to so-and-so, or count the votes. How many votes is it going to take? What is the committee with jurisdiction over this issue? And focus your attention, apply the laser-like focus on these individuals and the systems or committees or parties, chambers that they control. And then working backwards, you can figure out, okay, how are we going to talk about this to get the ear of the people who have the most influence? So in DC, as an example, we knew if we talked about this issue in terms of justice, we were going to mobilize the people. So that's the grassroots angle, and it's really worked. I mean, the other day, we had a press conference. We were expecting 40 people to show up. It was 100 people at noon, you know, like on a Tuesday, and it's amazing what people are hungry for, and that framing has worked. However, does not work in our case for the people with the lawmaking authority. So there's 2 lawmakers in particular. They're all Democrats, but these are not progressive Democrats. They're kind of moderate. They've been in office for 10, 20 years. They're not looking at these issues in an intersectional way. They want us, quote, to stay in our lane. You know, you guys are good environmentalists. Just do your environmental thing. Don't talk about, you know, economics. Don't talk about environmental justice. Don't talk about X, Y, and Z. So we've really been hammering how a basic income might be started with something like a carbon rebate, we're calling it, instead of a dividend. They don't want to hear anything about basic income. So we've had to really shift our framing on that. And I could keep going, but those are the main things. So coalition, flexibility, work within an existing framework, use your study to apply towards that, and then reverse engineer your framing.
And Camila mentioned that we're hopeful to have a bill introduction in July. The bill is going to be introduced not just by any DC City Council member, but by the woman who is the chair of the committee that the bill will hopefully be assigned to. So that's a big win, right? If you get the chair to introduce the bill, that's...
And I think we're in her ward right now, so go Mary Jane!
I want to, at this point, open it up for questions, so I'm going to walk down with the mic. I don't think the walking ones are working. Testing. Great. So I can walk this around. I'll start right here in the front.
Hi. I'm a legislator in New Hampshire, and I don't think a lot of people know about it yet, but a group called NCEL, National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, started this year with mostly people from the northeastern states, but legislators who wanted to join the Climate Cost Caucus, I believe it's called. Solutions? No, Climate Cost. It's for legislators to join, and they just start in January. So you could encourage your own legislators to look into this, and if they're interested, they could join it also, and that would help build momentum for this.
State or federal?
State.
State.
State legislators.
And could you say your name again and where you're from?
Yeah, Representative Marjorie Shepherdson from New Hampshire. This is for state legislators to join.
So it's called the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators? Or
CCC, Carbon Cost Coalition.
National Council?
Is it the
Thank
National Council of Environmental Legislators or the National Caucus?
Caucus.
Okay, so the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators.
National Caucus of Environment. Thank you very much for that announcement. And I'll come back here and give you the remote.
Thanks. My name is Paul Biederman. I'm from New Mexico. And we actually have a memorial that was passed through our Senate last session calling for a study of a carbon fee in New Mexico, a state one. It was actually promoted by a group of high school students and very successfully. Let me ask, since we have this study to do through an interim committee, I'm still struggling with, okay, how do we do this? How do we structure this? We can go and tax at the wellhead, but the amount of gas that we produce out of oil and gas that we produce out of New Mexico, while substantial, is not going to change the market. They're just going to not be profitable, and they're not going to be able to compete. So that's not the answer. I'm thinking we have to go to the gas pump and actually do it there at the end. But how did you structure your bills? And also the other question I have is, you said something about providing studies. Is that something you can do for other states as well?
Yeah, sure. So I can hop into the question on the studies. So right now, ClimateXChange has either commissioned or helped with the studies for about a dozen different states at this time. Our work facilitates everything from doing socioeconomic and emission or industry breakdown studies, as well as actually drafting the legislation for the legislators. NCEL has been an amazing convener, but they do not provide legislation. So we like to step in and be able to offer that, and we work very closely with the legislators that are a part of that group and are very comfortable with doing such. Now, and maybe you guys can answer the question in your individual states, I find that it's not something that you want to do on point of fee, would not be on the wellhead. Because then you're just going to get fuel sources from other states, and leakage is a real issue there. Where you don't see the leakage at what's called a racking station. So the racking station is actually, think of it as the distributor for the gas stations. And there's maybe a dozen or less in your state. It's not as difficult as then going and putting this fee at the individual gas stations, and be somewhat of a more cumbersome policy to oversee and manage. But that's how we've seen it develop in most states. Now we get some pushback that, okay, well, this trickles down to gas stations, then this is depending on your fees starting, could be anywhere from 5 cents to 15 cents of an increase in gas costs. So what's going to stop someone from just driving over state lines and going somewhere else to get gasoline? Right now in New Jersey, just because I looked you guys up recently, there is a 40-cent discrepancy in state on fuel costs. And how many people drive a car here, drive cars regularly? Okay, I'll give you two options. Do you go and buy gasoline based on where it's the cheapest fuel every time, or do you go and buy gasoline based on your car is out of gas? Yeah, so it's usually the latter of the two, and we don't really have to worry about the leakage issue of people driving across state lines, although it is maybe a little bit different in a smaller jurisdiction like DC.
Yeah. I wonder if I could mention too, so I've got a bunch of summaries of the Maryland bill, and it states here that the carbon price shall be collected on all CO2 emissions from fossil fuels at their first point of sale or transfer within the state for consumption or distribution within the state. Each electricity distributor in Maryland shall pay the carbon fee based on CO2 emissions from the generating plants, both in and outside the state from which they purchase their power. So I invite anyone to have a look at our summary. Also, ClimateXChange, which started out just as this group of CCL volunteers in Massachusetts, we did go ahead and file for C3 and C4 tax status, and we gave ourselves a name, ClimateXChange. And before that, though, FYI, we filed as a ballot question committee. So in a lot of states, and I found out to my surprise, a lot of states don't allow this, but many states do allow for ballot initiatives, such as is underway right now in Washington State. And I just want to tell you an interesting story. When we filed as a ballot question committee, there were 3 of us in Massachusetts. Myself, Gary Rosinski, who some of you may know, and a lovely woman named Kathy Carruthers, who's really the godmother of the whole state-level movement. Okay, so I went down to the Massachusetts State House and I filled out the forms to be a ballot question committee. I barely knew what that was. The next thing I knew, I was told by a former Secretary of State that the Koch brothers go through those filings every day, and they had bought up the floor of an office building in downtown Boston because they read that there was some group of people out there who had filed a ballot question for a carbon fee and dividend, and by God, they were going to destroy that just as fast as they could. So little did they know, we were 3 people. We were nobody, okay? Nobody. But my phone also started ringing from funders and from state legislators begging me to pull our ballot question because particularly Senator Barrett wanted to do this legislatively. He thought if we went down the ballot question route, we would be destroyed because we had not done the preparatory work. We hadn't built the coalitions. We hadn't educated the population. We hadn't educated the legislators. He believed we would fail. But I'll tell you, just filing that ballot question committee paperwork put us on the map and made us seem like we knew what we were doing. So anytime you create an organization and describe yourselves as a carbon pricing advocacy organization, you terrify a bunch of people and you send the message that you are bigger than you are and that something is afoot. Okay?
I see a lot of hands, and we only have 10 minutes left. I do want to take a sort of moderator's privilege here to ask a question because it's something that I've seen a lot in my work across the states with CCL volunteers. Each of you has talked about how you are sort of children of CCL, and the policies you're advancing are different than CCL's national revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend legislation. What experience have you had and what advice do you have to CCL volunteers who want to remain strong CCL-identified heroes and champions while also dabbling and lending effort towards campaigns working on the state level to price carbon that have slightly different policies?
So something I wanted to say anyways was to focus on outcomes. And I think that if there is an area of growth that I experienced as a dyed-in-the-wool CCLer, it's to do so instead of the mechanism, basically. Like, we talk a lot about carbon fee and dividend, and this is how it works, and border tax adjustments, and blah, 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 blah. You know, that's actually of interest mainly to people like us and not to the majority of people. And so we have to step them through the process that got us to this point of fascination and meeting people where they are with, do you think climate change is a problem? We know that's like #1. But then to the point where you're really, you know, moving them towards thinking about what's the most, the highest use of their time, the biggest bang for the buck, right? And you can apply that as a lens of flexibility as you look at other policy arrangements, like you will need to, and we all have had to at the state level, by, again, zooming out to like, okay, what is it that I'm really fighting for? And how can I piece this work into my theory of change? For me, it's been, okay, we need some dominoes to fall at the state level. Once one falls, like the other ones can move, and then the narrative that this policy is a great idea on paper, but it's never gonna happen in real life, that will be destroyed, and we can actually have some progress at the federal level, which is still what's nearest and dearest to my heart. And so from the political side, that's how I've come to think of it. From the policy side, what are the values that I'm fighting for? And that's what's always going to connect with people more than the policy specifics anyways. So what's important to me and what's important to this coalition is that it be economically progressive, that it be as straightforward as possible, you know, as few loopholes, as few options for corruption and getting out of this thing as possible, as strong as possible from a climate perspective. How do we actually get the emission reductions down? Well, you need a price that's high enough. How do you get there? Well, over time in an incremental way. And I think that's really applicable to any situation, and it'll come naturally for everyone here, I'm sure.
Okay, so and also one of the biggest problems we ran into was the question of, is this bill in the state level bill, is it going to be revenue neutral or revenue positive? And we all, as CCLers, when charging in there, Michael knows this painfully well, revenue neutral, revenue neutral, revenue neutral. And Michael here and a bunch of other members of our growing coalition said to us, no. N-O. We will not support you if this is revenue neutral. It will have to be partially revenue reinvestment. 10%, 20%, 50%, it's going to be revenue reinvestment. So we have learned, as I was alluding to earlier, we cannot be so rigid, or we will fail. We will fail. We are dealing with people who've been in this fight for a long time. They know about carbon pricing. They know what they're doing. we have to respect that, and as long as the poor are not hurt, the poor and the working class are not hurt, personally, we are more or less okay with revenue, some portion being revenue reinvested. And as a CCL volunteer too, I just want to say that when we first started CXC, I was like a chapter head of CCL, and every meeting, CCLers would say to me, well, am I supposed to work at the state level now, or am I supposed to work at the federal level? And I would say, you know, I've decided that I'm going to fight this war in the Pacific and in Europe, and I'm going to win both fronts, okay?
More questions?
I just wanted to say that I didn't know anything about this happening in CCL, but just 2 weeks ago, I was speaking with the state legislative aide in Wisconsin to Senator Ron Johnson, Republican senator, and he understood the carbon fee and dividend, but he asked, could this be done at the state level? Because I mentioned in some countries it was done at the province level. And that really appealed to him as conservative because he believes the states are the places where programs should be tested. And so I'm just throwing that out there, that it isn't just, I mean, it could have great influence in that way too.
And great conservative support to start at the state.
I applaud your passion. I can see a lot positive here, but this last remark reminds me of a potential danger, and that is a race to the bottom. As I think you know, this is a global problem, and as a result, individual countries, because of leakages, because they have little impact on the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere, have an incentive to set taxes too low. If you look at the state level, the problem is magnified. So might we get in a position where DC sets a tax of 10, Maine, my state, sets a tax of 7, and we all feel good that we've done something, but in fact, we need a federal solution that puts the tax at 50 and the same for everyone. Yep. Will we be diverting attention from the real problem?
I think that's such a good point, and in fact relates to a report from the Indigenous Environmental Network and Food and Water Watch. I don't know if you all saw that. That was rather controversial, and it was said the price is wrong. And it really was just a thorough critique of carbon pricing. I think they conflated too many ideas and didn't go into the specifics. However, one of the points that I think is good for us to think about is exactly that problem, that if the price is too low, then you do get a feeling that like, woof, you know, problem solved, let's move on. Because again, there's a danger of focusing too much on the mechanism, like I was saying, than the outcome. So if you start from the outcomes and you say this happens to be the policy that can get us the furthest, however, it's not going to be enough. There's still this gap, and you keep that pressure going. I think that's one possible solution. But the reason that I still think, even if there are weak carbon prices, if we set up this patchwork of carbon pricing across the country, it's a mess for industry. And if we look at TSCA, the Toxic Chemicals Reform Act that passed 2 years ago now, they were able to get stronger federal legislation because states had gotten tired of waiting and taken matters into their own hand, and California, as they tend to, you know, pushed so far ahead that the multinationals had trouble navigating regulations in different jurisdictions and thought this is an administrative nightmare. Fine, we'll let something go forward on the federal level. So that's my hope, at least.
A lot of people don't know that that's how the Clean Air Act was passed. Originally, there were Clean Air Acts passed in the states, and so then, like Wisconsin, I don't know, but Wisconsin, let's say you had to do X, and you know, Maryland Y, and it was so crazy that eventually the government was forced to do the national Clean Air Act.
Which would supersede all the state.
Yes, 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 yes.
I know there are a lot of questions. We've got less than 5 minutes left. Did you still have a question?
In the back, Jamie, do one in the back. The poor people in the back.
Okay, I'll run to the back. And please send me an email after this. If you have questions, I can get them answered.
I'm going to send around a sign-up sheet too, and we can contact you if you're interested in a study or what have you. Give us your name, and we'll contact you.
Hi, Isru Sen from New York. Great work, thanks guys. A question on, again, the applicability of state as a model for the federal. You mentioned the inability to do a pure dividend model. How, and also how should one state structure its policy such that it's a model that other states can look to and say, hey, California's doing this, New York's doing this, we should also follow suit? Like, how do you, is that a part of the calculus, or it has to be local, it has to be determined at what works for that state as opposed to think about what happens to the rest of it?
So yeah, let me, there's a few points that I wanted to raise in response to that, but it actually ties in a little bit into what states are doing and looking at California. So California initially passed language in their Global Warming Solutions Act in 2008 that said, it actually had legally binding language that the governor had to put a market mechanism in place to deal with the emissions. That was it. It's actually very similar to Global Warming Solutions Acts that have been replicated in Massachusetts and in a handful of other states, but it was no more than a sentence or two. Now here we are, what are we, 10 years later, and we've seen now that the California carbon market is one of the most robust global carbon markets that's out there, right? But it started out with that one little sentence, and then it was continually built on after that. Now, unfortunately, Massachusetts and many of our other states, we didn't proceed with actually having some kind of binding force. So we're now focused on circling back and changing and fixing that language that would then drive action. One of the things, and Camila brought this up, is the emissions gap that we're going to see. A majority, maybe not all, but most jurisdictions are not going to hit their climate emissions targets, especially not their 2020. Right now, no one has a plan to hit their 2050. So that's going to give us an opportunity here in the very soon future to start to hit them over the head with, okay, well, this is the policy that you need to move forward. They also need investment. They're going to need money. So that is, again, lends its hand to carbon pricing. I know that in the spirit of keeping it bipartisan, there seems to be a lot of ideas around having it as a revenue neutral fee and dividend. But I'll tell you that a majority of Republicans actually distrust the government making it revenue neutral and call your lie, call your bluff, than they're anti-tax. We got more feedback from Republicans not trusting us than they were anti-tax when we had just a revenue neutral bill. So, there's going to be opportunities here in the future where looking at California and how they've gone in incremental steps to now build a robust market, you might not all agree with the policy and how it's played out, but it offers an example of how policy can move forward.
It is 3:45. I want to make sure that people have time to get to their 4 o'clock presentation. Let's have another round of applause for all the panelists today. Thank you very much. Send me an email at jamie@citizensclimate.org if you have a question that didn't get to be asked.